Recessions sound terrible, but we've had 13 economic recessions since the end of World War II, and we've survived.
You are listening to Wealth Talks with the McPhees. You know, recessions are a part of life. And sometimes recessions seem to happen naturally, and sometimes they are forced by the people who are in power, who are looking for a wealth transfer. And before you write that off, let's talk about why that is and give you some of the reasons behind that, and then you can make your own decision.
Recessions are a natural part of life. Just like music, you have the crescendos and the decrescendos. You have the hills and the valleys of life.
I was thinking that the ocean waves, they come in, they go out.
Yep. But when government gets involved in trying to level out the ocean waves or make everything plain and blah for everybody, or keep the monetary system flat, or economic growth at 2% or less, now we get severe recessions. And those are exacerbated, and it builds up this huge volume, and then it crashes. And the latest one that most people remember is 2008, when people lost 80% or more of what they thought was theirs in their portfolios.
Yeah. And these things, they happen on a pretty regular basis. And so it's a fact of life. We have to expect them and plan for them so that you can make money even during a recession. So today we want to talk about, when those recessions do come along, how are you prepared for them so you can still make money?
So let's define what a recession is to start with. What classifies economically as a recession?
Well, it's when economic growth doesn't expand for two sequential quarters.
Okay,
that's the technical definition. So you never know if you're in a recession until you're looking at the data in hindsight.
Oh, interesting. So you can't go, okay, here we go into a recession. You have to go, oh, look, we were in a recession.
Yeah. And you don't really know if you're still in it until the data comes out either.
Oh, sure.
That's the definition. Of course, different people can be in different recessions. Different parts of the economy can be in recession while other parts are expanding. And so this isn't a clear-cut measure, but it is the way the stats are figured.
So how does government, or the quasi-government programs that have been set up where Congress has abdicated its duty and given it over to someone else, how does that exacerbate a recession?
Well, I think here you're talking about the Federal Reserve System. The boom and bust cycle, that existed long before the Federal Reserve System, because what would happen is the banks would lend money that they didn't have, and that money would go out into the economy. It would create the illusion of growth. And so all these businesses would start up, these factories would expand. And then too many people went to the banks to get their money back. That's a problem. And all of a sudden you had these bank crashes and people taking their money out. And now, because the bank was relying on the deposits to back up all the money that they had lent out, they had to call those loans back in. And so it caused the economy to collapse. And so one of the ways that the politicians wanted to help resolve this problem was by evening everything out. They didn't want the banks to stop lending money they didn't have. They just wanted to regulate it and control it.
They wanted to be in control. And so there's a huge transfer of wealth when a bust happens.
There is.
And they wanted to be on the receiving end.
Yeah. And so they looked at this situation here. And there were a number of banking agreements and banks that would get together and say, hey, we'll back you up if you do back this up, and they would follow certain guidelines. But until the Federal Reserve System came along, that system was promised, if you look back at history, to try and even out this boom and bust cycle. Of course, it didn't happen. As we all know, we still have those recessions, and even the Great Depression, which happened shortly after the Federal Reserve was established. It just changed who was in control, and now it's politically sanctioned. But the Federal Reserve is really not part of the federal government, are they?
No, they're not. They're a quasi form of government.
They're in cahoots with the federal government.
Some people call them a cartel, and they fit a lot of the definitions of what a cartel is.
They do, yeah.
Because basically, when politicians want to spend more money and they haven't collected enough taxes and it's not in the Treasury, they just go to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve magically produces more money for them to spend. It's like an overdrawn checking account that the Federal Reserve sits on top of and just says, oh, your check is good, even though you don't have the money there.
Yeah. And some politicians, I think they justified that. When you look back at history and read the records, they wanted the country to have an unlimited supply of money during wartime, even if they couldn't raise the money. And so there was that element in there, even if people didn't specifically want to transfer, the money to the business, to the big business owners and all that. They wanted money for a war effort. And so you look back, even in the Civil War, there was a huge amount of money that was printed to fund the war effort that ended up eroding the economy and causing inflation.
Even in the Revolutionary War, the Continentals, you're not worth a Continental because they printed so much of it that it just became worthless.
Yeah, and so the Federal Reserve System is a way that they could still do that, both for wars, but then we have a lot of things that have been funded that are not for wars anymore. And so we see inflation on a consistent basis.
So it lets us understand why Thomas Jefferson said that banks are more dangerous than standing armies. And he was talking about the standing armies in Europe that would just march over and control everybody just at a king's edict. And so that's what we've got right now. We're enslaved to the banking system that has been set up in this country, which has devalued our dollar by almost 100% since it was founded in 1913.
It is huge. And so we have this inflation. It's a fact of life. And some people say, well, there's the problem right there. We got to get rid of the Federal Reserve System. And yet, in the system that we're living in, that's not really a realistic goal.
It's not feasible. And
so what can we do, knowing that this is a problem? What can we do to plan our lives so that when these recessions happen, we have something to work back against that with? It's not going to be perfect because we all live in the system, but we can either approach inflation with an attitude of fear, which we've talked about on a recent show, or we can approach it with an attitude of faith. Life is going to continue beyond this point. Even if it looks like sometimes that the world might go into hyperinflation, people are still going to need services. There's still going to be things that need provided. How can you position yourself to still be relevant in that type of situation?
The good news is that there are 3 things that you can do to actually make a profit in a recession. And we're going to talk about those and give those 3 things to you here in a minute. But first, let's talk about Robert Kiyosaki and Nelson Nash, because they have some information that will help you put these 3 things into practice so that you can make a recession a profitable experience for you instead of having to tighten your belt. So Robert Kiyosaki wrote a book just recently called Why A and B Students Work for C Students. And that sounds like, you're just going to take your average Joe Blow and you're going to put him up there and you're going to make him smarter than A and B students. Because A and B students, we know, I was an A student, you were an A student, you were an A student. That's kind of condescending to those people that pushed hard and academically and made. But the key is that many, many A students become academics. And academics in our world kind of think that they're God's gift to mankind. Okay? They're sitting in the ivory towers. They really don't have a lot of practical experience, but they have all these theories that they've come up with in their logical mind. We can talk about some of those people and name them if we wanted to.
I'm thinking of one who a number of years ago, he said, ideas come from the academics. And I thought, are you serious? Let those people think that because, while the rest of us do something. And I think that's what Robert Kiyosaki was
That's
trying
basically
to say.
Advocating for a class system that's composed of the academics at the top, right? The ideas coming down from that ivory tower.
Yes.
But it could be aristocrats instead of academics because that's what they really are.
Yeah.
Okay. They believe that they know best for everybody because they're so brilliant.
So you're talking about you're talking about A students with a certain mindset.
Yeah.
Here,
Exactly.
a superior mindset. There's A students that obviously are productive members of the society, not afraid to get into the trenches and to do good work. And there's A students that think they're better than everyone else and want to be at the top.
Well, and I think those A students too, I think he's referring to, they kind of follow the rules.
Okay.
There's this set of parameters and these are, but then they also make their own parameters that may not even be part of reality. So they make these parameters and they get all these designs and ideas that maybe don't fit the real world.
And it's really, really important to have A students in the world. because they're brilliant. We've got the Einsteins and the people like that maybe never got down into the the manual work or anything like that, and they didn't really create big businesses, but they gave us insights and new theories and scientific evidence that allowed C students to take that information and move. Henry Ford is a good example of a C student that had a lot of A students working for him. And he was in court one day being sued, and the prosecution was asking him, well, what about this? He says, I don't know. Call in so-and-so. He knows.
Now,
because he surrounded himself with these very intelligent people, but he coordinated it all and put it into practical use rather than this academic theory.
And then you're also not suggesting that, we go back and research Henry Ford's report cards and we'll find C's. He may have been an A student, but he's got a C student mentality of let's find a way to do what we need to do without necessarily getting the society marks of approval.
Well, we're not talking about intelligence here. We're just talking about where people have applied themselves the most. Okay? And, so academics really get into the book learning and the research and the details and that's where they live, and that's fine. B students, they don't really like to get into all that stuff, but they really want to have power. They really want to control things, and they tend to gravitate toward politics. Okay?
Interesting.
They're more charismatic. They like to get in there and influence people, and they believe that their ideas are going to lead society into a better way. That's where most politicians start out. I want to give them the benefit of the doubt. Even though when they often get in there, they get corrupt, as we know. So what C students do, they're very intelligent people too, is they get the A and the B students to work for them, to bring the intelligence and the new ideas, the frontier examiners, the academics, and they have to then coerce the politicians, the B students, to get what they want, And we can see this all the time. The lobbyists are always buying the politicians. It's just a matter of fact. This is the way life works. And so Robert Kiyosaki breaks this down to A, B, and C students.
Okay.
Whether that fits you or...
It's a generalization, prototype.
Sure.
Yeah.
Nelson Nash was a C student. He probably got A's. He was a Forrester, but he was a C student because he was a practical thinker. And he took the academic world of Ludwig von Mises, the Austrian School of Economics, and he looked at what was happening in the political world, and he says, how can we blend this together? And he came up with an idea that's called the infinite banking concept.
But he also came up with that idea not just because he's sitting around trying to think of ideas. He had a calamity in his life. He was in a tough position. And all of a sudden he's thinking, what am I going to do? And so he takes information and he works it out into a solution for his economic crisis.
And that's what C students do best. Politicians think they're going to solve the world's problems. Academics think they've got the answer for everything. But C students actually take the good ideas that the academics have and some of the ideas that politicians have, and they put it into practical use, because we know that government never solves any problem. When it gets its hand into stuff, it always makes it worse. But we have to work inside government because there's laws that govern what we can and can't do. Well, that's what Nelson Nash did.
And that's what you were just speaking of, John, when you said, there's the Federal Reserve and we've got some rules. This is the, world we live in. But how can we figure out how to use that information to make our life better?
Right.
Yeah. So Nelson Nash in the early 80s found himself paying 1.5% above prime, because he said he wasn't prime. He wasn't a Donald Trump. He wasn't a Warren Buffett. He didn't get prime rates. So when he borrowed money, he had to pay 1.5% above it. And he found himself paying 23% interest on raw land. Raw land doesn't bring any income in.
And that's because interest rates were so high in
prime
the 1980s.
Was 21% in 1982. It was huge.
So 23%, that's like credit card interest today.
This card game is fun to play and teaches character from the Bible. 52 poker-grade playing cards represent hours of fun for years to come. Children, teens, and adults like this game because it is exciting and stimulating. This game is a great choice for family game night, and a clever way to turn screen time into family time. Try to contain your excitement as you attempt to collect all of the characters in a suit before anyone else. You can order this card game by clicking on the link in the podcast description, or go to Amazon.com and search Wise Man, Foolish Man card game.
Wow,
Huge.
on just raw land. So he's not getting any income on this raw land.
That's right.
No cash
Wow.
flow. Probably paying taxes on it. It's actually probably an outlay unless he was harvesting. He was a forester, so maybe he was growing some trees, but that's a long-term investment too.
Yeah.
You don't use you put a lot of money into that type of investment before you get the harvest.
But this land was raw, so there was no production on it or anything. And so here he is subject to the bureaucrats that have caused interest rates to go crazy. And he's listening to the academics that are telling him to sell this property now at a loss so that he can take a huge deduction on his taxes.
I remember what he said, because he used to tell the story, of what happened to him. And they'd tell him, well, sell it. And he said, where am I going to find the fool who will buy it?
Yeah, 23% interest.
Yeah.
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 And
Unless
so-
they have the cash to do it, that's going to be
And
that's a tough
why would they
proposition.
want to buy that kind of property in the market was terrible at that time.
So this is what academics and bureaucrats set up, though. They would have liked him to sell that property because that would have been a transfer of a lot of wealth to the A and B group. Because what happens is he can't afford it, but the market goes up and down, and the people that have capital,
have
that
the
have
cash.
the money,
Yep.
that can get the politicians to print more money for them to hold that land until the market, then they can sell it.
Because if he'll sell it at a low enough price, they'll buy it all right.
And there'll be a huge transfer of wealth. Well, fortunately, Mr. Nash had a vision, he said. It came to him like a baseball bat across the forehead. And he said, wait a second. I've been paying premiums into my whole life insurance for 25 years. It was policies his brother had sold him years ago. He says, I can go get money out of that life insurance and borrow it from the insurance company between 6 and 8%. That beats 23%. And so he did. He borrowed that money, and he says he went and paid off those snakes and dragons, the A and B students. Okay. And he then discovered that he can be his own bank. He doesn't have to be subject to the bureaucrats. He can survive even in a recession. And several years later, he sold that land at a huge profit to the state of Alabama for them to put an interstate clover on.
You mentioned the wealth transfer that that would have happened back in the 80s, but this is more modern day as well. If we go to a more modern day example, Las Vegas area is a great example. 2005 to 2008 was a really tough time for builders and for real estate homeowners in the Las Vegas Valley. It was one of the areas of the country that was hardest hit by that recession when the interest rates had been kept so low for new home buyers that it caused the mortgage crisis. So you had these home prices that crashed, and then you had institutional investors that came in and bought up everything under $100,000.
Way below what market value would have been just 6 months earlier.
Right. And then as those homes under $100,000 have been gone, now they've moved up the chain. So they moved up, they bought everything under $200,000, and now it's very difficult to find anything in the Las Vegas Valley for under $300,000 as those institutional investors have come in, they buy up everything, and then they rent it back to the people that need to live there. And that's problematic for wealth creation over time because that ownership element is important.
Well, we just recently moved to Indiana, and one of our neighbors is from Europe, and she's married to someone that's also from Europe. They came here and they got their citizenship. And she was warning us that this is what happened in Europe, even before she left Europe years ago. This is a communist plan to take over. It's a Marxist idea that government knows best. The bureaucrats always want to run and control every aspect of your life. And she says, people in America need to wake up, because when this transition of wealth happens, then the average person, us commoners, are no longer going to be free and independent like our founding fathers wanted us to be.
Ownership is important to that concept, because if you're always renting, you don't have that say in the way that things work. Yeah. And of course, this isn't a tirade against anyone who needs to rent. But it's just that you want to have that ownership component long term. So many people think this way, though, about their life insurance, too. They'll rent term insurance all their life, but the ownership component of whole life insurance is very important over time if you want to build real wealth. And it ties into what we're talking about here. How did Nelson Nash access money between 5 and 8% interest when the snakes and dragons were charging him 23%?
Well, here's point number one. You need to keep part of everything that you make, regardless of how much you're making or what your expenses are. You need to keep part of everything you make. Michelle, we're just reading Calvin Coolidge here. You want to read that quote by Calvin Coolidge, one of the best presidents we ever had, who understood economics probably better than any other president we've had.
So I know very well what it means to awake in the night and realize that the rent is coming due and wondering where the money is coming from with which to pay it. The only way I know of escape from that constant tragedy is to keep running expenses low enough so that something may be saved to meet the day when earnings may be small.
It sounds pretty
straightforward.
But it is just, don't live above your means. Always keep something tucked away so that you're ready for when something happens, because something is going to happen. We have these crescendos and decrescendos in life all the time, even without the Federal Reserve. Those were some principles that he brought to the presidency as well.
Yes.
And he cut taxes and he made the government more fiscally sound. And we could sure use another Calvin Coolidge in our era.
Yeah, because he wasn't suggesting that we should take it from the rich to provide for the poor. He's saying, no, you plan ahead and you save for times that are going to be more lean.
Yeah. And here's the here's the backstory on this. Calvin Coolidge, as a lawyer, he would make money, but then when he'd be called to political service, his income would go down.
Way down.
And so he had to be prepared for those times in order to weather that out, be able to be a public servant, and still get ahead financially, which brings us to point number 2. A lot of people are disciplined when it comes to saving. They can put money away if they have a purpose and a goal that they're putting it toward. But then if they put it somewhere where they can't get to it again, that defeats a part of the purpose of saving. So you've got to store your money. But this is point number 2 here. You've got to store your money in a place where you can still access it.
Still access it and still get guaranteed value and increase.
Yeah, because what if you put it in an investment account and you lose 30% next year?
Yes.
Well, you just lost some of your access, even though you hope it's going to come back. You lost time.
Yeah.
Or if you take money out of that investment to go do something with it, then you no longer have it there earning anything for you. Where if you have it in a whole life policy and you're borrowing the insurance company's money while your money is still held and still earning, then you're getting value on both sides.
And this is what Nelson Nash had been disciplined to do. He didn't really realize it until he was in the middle of this situation, but he had been paying what would have been considered fairly large life insurance premiums throughout the years leading up to the 1980s. And then when he gets into this situation where he's paying 23% interest, he has money available that he can use to pay off the snakes and dragons. Now, he says if he would have realized this, he would have put even more away.
The fact is, he said that when he gets to heaven, he's going to have a sit down with his brother and say, why didn't you make my premiums higher?
Right.
Because the more we can put away, the better we are.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you said it's pretty easy to save for something that you're planning, like a vacation or
a goal that you have.
We used to put aside money because we wanted to buy a travel trailer for the family, or we wanted to buy a new vehicle. And when we'd get it all, we'd take it out and we would go get what we had, but then we only had what we bought. Now, the wealthy C students never think that way. They always say, how can I get this shiny object, this asset, and get my money as well? And that's the third point here. If you're going to access this money that you've set aside, particularly in participating whole life insurance, then when you access it and get your shiny object, your asset, your vacation, whatever you're going to spend it on, You have to be honest with yourself and pay back to the life insurance what you would have paid someone else had you had to finance it. This was a very, very hard lesson for me to learn because I thought I was saving interest by paying cash for everything when we saved up our money.
Which you were.
But I didn't realize how much interest I was losing for the rest of my life on that cash pile that I had saved.
Yeah, you only went
once
halfway.
I spent it, the interest lost for the rest of my life. It's gone. Whereas on a life insurance policy, that keeps compounding for the rest of my life. It didn't go away.
Yeah. Super important.
Those are the three things.
And the way that you can kill that system is to take a loan, take a policy loan, start the life insurance, get it built up, take the loan, and then not pay it back. Because then you do kill the compounding curve. If you take the loan and then pay it back, you keep that compounding curve going.
Yes.
If you take the loan and don't pay it back, now you have the interest and you don't have that compounding curve.
Yeah.
You kill the system.
Well, when I was a kid, I remember listening to a story about Hop the grasshopper and Andy the ant.
I remember you telling us this story.
Well, every once in a while he'll break out in a little song about it. I love it when that happens.
Hop was this jovial creature that thought nothing in the world could ever be bad, and he partied and had a good time all summer long, playing his fiddle with his little friend, the cricket Gabriel, and they would sing and dance, and Andy was marching along, sweating in the ant line, bringing in the harvest and whatnot, and packing away for winter, and he could hear the music, and he just longed to go sing with them because he was very musical, and one day he broke out a line, and he went. And they sang a little trio, and then the queen ant showed up and said, now you've got a quartet. And she shoved Andy back in the line and marched him, and he said he worked hard to make up for his lost time. But Hop laughed, and he says, winter is so far away, summer is the time to play. And he laughed and went into another song. Well, it wasn't long before winter came, and Hop had an enemy called Bubba, the buzzard, who hated music. And so every time he heard Hop's music, he would go into a rage. And so he was always hunting for him. And when the snows came, Bubba spotted Hop, a green speck on the snow. But Hop was so cold he turned blue. And Bubba got mad because he thought it was a green spot and it was a blue spot. And he got in trouble because of that. But Andy heard Hop's help because he had stumbled down on this little hill by the ants' colony, and they rushed out, got Hop, and brought him back in. And Andy asked him to play, and he said, only if I can change my tune. And the tune that he changed it to, you ants were right the time you said you got to work for all you get. And that's what a lot of people in America don't understand anymore. We have to work, or we don't have anything to save. We don't have anything to put away. And so many people just think it's going to come by magic. Something's going to fall out of the sky. You're going to win the lottery. Some rich uncle's going to die. It's surprising how many people are waiting for an inheritance instead of getting on with their life and working. And the problem is when you win a lottery or you do an inheritance, if you haven't prepared by working hard, it's not going to benefit you.
True.
More than 70% of people that win the lottery are worse off 5 years after they won it than they were before. So maybe we should say this is really 4 things. You got to work.
True.
And you got to work hard. And then you have to keep part of everything you save.
Yeah,
And
keep
then
that for the leaner times.
Yes. And then you've got to put it in a place where you can access it without getting penalized and losing all the interest on it for the rest of your life, the compound growth. And finally, you have to be honest with yourself. And if you tap into those resources, you have to pay it back as if you were paying someone else you had to borrow money from.
Yeah. All of these principles that we're talking about, at the end of the day, it goes back to wise stewardship.
It does.
Taking care of the resources that God has entrusted to us in a way that will glorify Him and create more to be there for tomorrow for the purposes that He has in mind. That's why I love your latest book, A Biblical Guide to Personal Finance. You can get this book on wealthtalks.com. I think it's the best book that Mom and Dad have written. You are listening to Wealth Talks with the McPhees. Have a wonderful week, and we'll be back next week.